My phone.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We'll have plenty of time to network after the event. I would like to start promptly. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Daniela Stevens, and I'm the Director of the Energy Transition and Climate Program here at the Inter-American Dialogue. Today, we will explore the dynamic energy landscape in the Caribbean. The importance of energy in driving economic development, empowering communities and businesses, and preserving our planet cannot be overstated. The Caribbean region, with its diverse economies and abundant natural resources, presents a unique aggregate of energy needs, aspirations, and opportunities. The question is if the key players will seize the opportunities and pave the way for a resilient and sustainable energy future. The dialogue has gathered fantastic Caribbean experts to harness their collective expertise, insights, and experiences to discuss not only a diagnosis, but to propose innovative pathways that address regional and national challenges and unlock the immense potential of the Caribbean energy sector. In what follows, we will delve into key themes such as balancing hydrocarbon E&P with the urgent calls for a more efficient, sustainable, and green energy matrix, territorial claims made by Venezuela over Guyana, the Chinese presence in the region, and how to foster and finance a just energy transition more effectively. We encourage your active participation in the Q&A, and if you're joining us via Zoom or live stream, we ask that you send your questions via the Q&A chat or email us at meetings@thedialogue.org. I would like to extend my gratitude to our terrific speakers, whom I'll introduce in alphabetical order. Joining us, we have David Goldwyn. He is president of Goldwyn Global Strategies, LLC, an international energy advisory consultancy, and chairman of the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center's Energy Advisory Group. He's a globally recognized thought leader, educator, and policy innovator in energy security and extractive industry transparency. He has served as the U.S. State Department Special Envoy and Coordinator for International Energy Affairs, and Assistant Secretary of Energy for International Affairs, among many other roles. Joining us, we also have David Gumbs. He serves as the Director of Rocky Mountain Institute's Islands Energy Program, advising governments, utilities, and the private sector on renewable energy strategies to enhance cost efficiency and resilience. Before joining RMI, he founded Davi Business Solutions, offering energy solutions across the US, Africa, and the Caribbean. As CEO of the Anguilla Electricity Company, he spearheaded the renewable energy initiatives, elevating ANGLEC to one of the region's highest penetration levels. Finally, we have Vera Rechsteiner. She's a partner with Hunton Andrews Kurth. Her practice concentrates on the development, financing, acquisition, and disposition of energy, oil and gas infrastructure facilities, and tax structuring for energy acquisitions and international project development. She has worked on energy, infrastructure, and related projects in the US and throughout Latin America, Africa, and Asia. She has also advised commercial and multilateral lenders in a variety of structured and corporate finance transactions. Thank you all so much for joining us. And I'd like to start setting the scene. First of all, I'd like to start with David. David, there are 3 countries in the Caribbean region that are fossil fuel producers. The rest are net importers of energy. Tell us a little bit about the dynamics that this landscape creates, and especially your analysis of what's it gonna take to fuel the energy transition in the region that is so diverse.
Thank you so much for having me here today. It's a pleasure to represent RMI and the region on this panel. Couple of keywords: diverse. The region is very diverse, both in the number of countries, but in just having more than 30 independent nations, you have a situation where even the largest ones are small in scale, both in geography and capacity. So it presents a significant challenge for the region. But there is a lot of hope and a lot of great things happening in the region that should be highlighted, because it demonstrates that there's potential and successful pathways for the region to transition. And one of the biggest opportunities is in the renewable energy sector. Even sort of typically when we look at the region, you're looking at small scale relative to the rest of the world or any, large developed nation. But if you aggregate the region as a whole, you're talking about $100 billion just in the energy sector for the transition to happen. That in itself opens up a lot of opportunities. And you'll see in places like Barbados, which is one of the leaders in the region today, that has opened up the market, both and put the right policies and practices in place and promoted essentially renewable energy as a right. That has led to, at this point, overheating the market to the extent that they had to freeze all new connections to the grid. There's about 200 megawatts of pent up or projects in the queue, investments to be made, which at this rate are substantial for a small country like Barbados. So that demonstrates that there's tremendous demand and pent-up demand that is waiting for those opportunities. I'm sure my colleagues will get into some other areas where certain things need to happen to make that possible. But there is so much potential in the region, and we'll demonstrate through a couple of further examples.
A couple of examples of success that you can share.
Yeah. There are some smaller islands that have gone 100%. In the context of renewable energy, it's never fully 100. It's 90% thereabout. So smaller territories like Statia, for example, at one point was up to 60. They had more development, more tourism. They're now back down below 50. But they're going for another phase that should bring them to 70, 80%. So it's practical, it's doable, it's working. There are some parts of the Bahamas, Ragged Island, for example, is up to 90%. Small island, small population, but same grid, same network, actually much weaker system than most. But it's done, and it's done in a way that is resilient, Category 5 resilient, and it's working without little fanfare or, how you call it, risk or outages and so forth. So reliability has improved tremendously. On a larger scale, Barbados is probably the best example. There were some early starters, Aruba, Curacao, and some of the others that were out the gates with wind and solar in particular, and had a couple of things in place, but they've sort of slowed down on their transition efforts. So much to be said. There are lots of examples to work with. I think it's just putting those right mechanisms in place to make it happen.
And mainly you focus on your intervention on renewable energy, but I have a follow-up question for all of you. And we're talking about the energy transition. What does the energy transition even look like in the region? Again, going back to diversity, to natural resource endowment. You've talked about renewables. Is there a role for natural gas? If 100% renewables is not feasible for every single country, what is feasible? What is the next best option for all these diverse countries? Let's start with you again, David, and then go with Vera, and then David Goldwyn.
Yeah, this is always an intriguing question. The moment you mention natural gas, it spawns a debate that is happening in the sector, and that is, what's the role of natural gas as a transition fuel? And the way we package it essentially is this: not every country has a role for natural gas. They can be transitioned rather quickly and easily with solar, wind, batteries, and other means. Now, there are some that are geothermal focused, so that's an opportunity for them to transition 100 and export energy with geothermal. So there wouldn't be a role for natural gas in that case. In the sectors or the countries that may be producing natural gas, clearly, there is a expectation that they would use some of that to help themselves lower costs of electricity and make that transition happen. But typically, and this is more David Gumbs than any, say, RMI even, but typically the way I see it, both from my experience as a utility executive and the work that we've been doing in the analysis we've done in the region, the infrastructure related with natural gas is a high outlay of costs that usually leads to a 30-year investment or payback that is very significant. In the meantime, the cost of renewable energy, solar, wind, is on a downward curve. Battery storage has dropped tremendously in the last 5 years in terms of cost. So it's the least cost approach at this point in time in terms of levelized cost of energy. So anyone considering that has to be very careful about the decision they're making. You want to make the right decision. Both of them have a significant upfront cost. One is more base load focused, the other is variable. But if you consider renewable as not just solar, but solar battery and all the complementary things, it can be done the way that base load is not a second consideration. It will solve the problem, and it will solve it at a lower cost of energy. A little more technical than that, but I'll leave it there.
Thanks, David. Vera, what are your thoughts?
Well, hello, everybody. Nice to be here. Thank you. I agree with David that with respect to one of the challenges in the Caribbean is that you have different island sizes. I have to put this up. Island sizes with different resources. And so agree that there are certain islands where it makes sense that we move to a renewable focus more directly. But then you have other islands, for example, the Dominican Republic, where you clearly have a country that started down the path some time ago with a focus on diversifying its energy matrix. And that included gas. But what's at work there is not just supplying the Dominican Republic, but also, if you look at AES and its presence in the region, it's really a hub for other countries in Central America. So you need to think about, I think, each country separately. The other thing that's happening, of course, that is impacting on the transition is the evolution of technology. I agree 100%, David, that the cost, just like the cost of solar panels came down, the same will happen with battery storage, and we'll get better about pricing them into the PPAs correctly so that they're usable and bankable. However, at the same time, we're seeing a lot of technologies out there that are focused on small LNG transport that are being utilized in Norway and other countries. So what those technologies are focused on is getting to the point where LNG can be transported on smaller ships that brings the cost down, almost a bunkering concept. I don't think we're there yet, but what's really happening is this evolution of the technologies at the same time that you have our transition to renewables. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out over the next 10 years for gas.
Thanks, Vera. Please, David.
Oh, a couple of thoughts. Thanks for having me, and great to be here with David and Vera. First, I think in terms of the energy transition in the Caribbean, it's been going really slowly on a project-by-project incremental basis with some success stories in Barbados and maybe Jamaica. But we're not going to be able to scale this transition and go quickly unless the model changes. And I think that tells you a couple of things. One, I agree completely that it's a very heterogeneous region. You cannot design a regional or even a sub-regional approach, and you need kind of a hybrid approach for each country. I think the focus probably needs to be a resilience focus and a growth focus. Emissions is not a problem for the Caribbean per se, but countries need to have electricity that is lower cost, because heavy fuel oil is both high emitting and it makes the economies uncompetitive. They need to have systems that can survive hurricanes for those that are in the hurricane belt. And they have to be capable of promoting growth for the countries, and this is more as Trinidad's story or Guyana or others, where they're going to have industry that is going to need to be fueled as well. So that really is the focus, and I think that dictates what kind of system you have. We did a report that came out in September at the Atlantic Council on our roadmap for the Caribbean, but we said the countries need help with a little bit of diagnosis. First, an integrated systems analysis, which counts not just how much power you're going to need over the next 20 or 30 years, but transportation and industry, so that you have a total demand picture that's going to help investors. That hasn't been done. That's something donors and others ought to really pay for. The second is that you're not going to solve the problems in these countries unless you deal with utilities. Some of them are state-owned, some of them are private, some of them have 20-year supply contracts. You will not change a system in any country if you're putting the inherent utility out of business. So they have to be either de-risked or brought in or accommodated, but you need something that's going to deal with the utility, or politically they'll defeat you. And I'm sympathetic because the utilities in these small islands are both responsible for delivering electricity, they're politically accountable for low costs, and you bring in new competitors that's going to bankrupt them, and it's like, how are we supposed to do this? The government won't support it either, even with 100% renewable goal. So you need that. You need to look at transmission. I think David pointed out why you can't get a bunch of investors to come in to build generation if they don't know how they're going to deliver it. And also, it may be distributed generation that you want, something for the capital and something for other areas. And we kind of need a new financing model too, because the reality is you cannot finance this transition with just debt. So this is either for the IDB or these various funds. You need a sliver of equity to be able to create more confidence in the system and build projects, because you want a wind farm in the Eastern Caribbean, Equinor's not interested, Ørsted is not interested. It's too small. Nobody wants to build one wind farm. So you're talking about, a build, operate, transfer, buying the kit, scaling up the capacity in the government. I mean, it's a lot. It's not a lot of money. It's a lot of effort to bring them to that scale. So I think, in terms of the model, we can talk about this more. The international financial community, the finance community, the MDBs, the US in particular, if this is a geopolitical area of interest, and it is, need to do things in a much bigger way, which is not big by like Ukraine scale, but it's big by Caribbean scale. And just to finish on gas, I think the reality is that until for a lot of countries, you're going to need gas for backup, or you're going to need gas for industry. It's actually not, the model has changed now with floating storage regasification units. You could have gas for 8 years, and then they could transition off of it. You don't have 30-year contracts anymore. Even Europe is signing 10 and 12-year or 15-year LNG contracts. So there are cheaper ways to access gas and shorter terms for accessing gas. But I don't think, from a resilience point of view, for many countries, you can go to 100% renewables. But maybe you're going to have a hybrid model for a decade. Maybe it'll be 12 years. It doesn't have to be permanent. Shouldn't be locked in as permanent. But I think it's going to be indispensable for the short term.
So I think, please go
Can I
ahead.
just add to that? I just wanted to piggyback on your comment about the financing, because 100% correct. There's good news in the sense that there is plenty of capital out there. Availability of debt capital is not an issue, even with higher interest in the markets. There's also a lot of progress that has been made. We see this in the Caribbean in terms of many countries, and you spoke a little bit about this, drafting and adopting, IEPs, plans. So that process is in place. I think what you're saying, which is the need for equity to bridge some of that gap, is important. It's also important to remember that equity looks at the same risks that debt does. And we're going to speak about that a little bit, but one of the challenges, or the big challenges that we see for financing, is not just debt, but making sure that the legal and regulatory frameworks of these countries is such that more capital other than just technical assistance funds can be made available. So there are mezzanine products out there. We saw more of this previously. I've seen less mezzanine lately, but there are providers, and there's pension funds that have set up even country-specific funds. So we're going to speak about this, but that's how do we get from that transition, right? From the project to making it bankable and available for that transition.
Vera, this is actually a great segue. You've wide experience assisting lenders, assisting funders. What do you perceive as I would call them untapped opportunities and challenges for the region in terms of regulatory frameworks that you mentioned, in terms of how to make projects bankable, and in terms of the needs to incentivize investment overall? What are the issues financing a project in the Caribbean?
Well, I'll go ahead and start, but of course it depends on the country again. But let's give one example where there is, in our view, untapped resources. You mentioned it, geothermal in St. Lucia. Yes, it's possible to bring in a private developer in, do a PPP, and develop the resource. But there's a cost with these high capital cost projects up front that will have to be passed on to the ratepayer. So one thing that we've seen in St. Lucia is the World Bank with its climate funds coming in and essentially de-risking that initial phase, which is the drilling of the two production wells to see if, to prove the resource. So that's an excellent example of where these types of funds or technical assistance can help bring down the capital cost on that type of a project. Otherwise, the truth is that these projects can't be done by governments. They need private sector investment. And other than distributed generation, which are smaller projects and not PPA linked, the projects need to have a bankable PPA, number one. And that PPA, if it is awarded in a bid process, needs to be an auction process that to the investment community is very clear, transparent, so that the investors that are participating can walk away from the process and say, well, my project didn't win, but I have a comfort level in the way this bid was handled. So those would be the two key items that really drive the investment in private sector. We can talk a lot about PPAs and what are some of the key issues, and including utility credit on those, but I'll pass it over to David.
Yeah, I don't know who thought this would be a simple, easy answer type of discussion today, but this is a very complex matter and a complex region. But I agree with essentially everything that David and Vera has said, because I'm here nodding, it's like, yeah, good point, yeah, good point. But it's very nuanced, right? The approach is country by country, and I think we're going to dig into some of the umbrella type things that could go in place to help support that type of complexity in the region. But in terms of financing, that's one of the areas where I'm not over the hump yet to be a believer that financing is available, both on the debt side and on the equity side. There are a lot of things that are championed, a lot of initiatives that are sounded, but when you dig into them, it's either extraordinary hurdle to overcome because even the MDBs have their risk tolerance. And that drives me nuts in the region. I mean, it really drives me nuts because to me, their function is to take on the risk, right? Or to put in the resources to de-risk the projects. And I'm telling you, I spend days and nights, too many nights, trying to solve that problem. And it's not working. So something different needs to take place. And I believe, though David and Vera said, private sector engagement is probably where it's going to happen. And there are a couple of initiatives like the CARICOM Resilience Fund that was launched about a month ago. And there are a lot of funds that are launched in the region. Even the RMI, we launched a fund in the region. Funds are very difficult to capitalize for the same reason. And that is investor tolerance for risk. And taking risk on a small scale, country by country or project by project is difficult. So what we intend to do is develop those bankable projects, the pipeline, build the pipeline, build capacity, regional capacity that can continue to build and grow that pipeline. And I make it sound seamless and easy, but we know that's a big challenge and a big hurdle, and it's going to take significant amount of funding to make that happen. But I see a lot of positive things that are happening that are very encouraging around this one in particular, because it's CARICOM, a couple of countries, the major countries in the region are all part of CARICOM, and then there are a bunch of associate members. So that framework alone gives it the support and the basis to work on. So go ahead. Yeah.
No, I agree with Dave and Vera. I think we're actually saying the same thing, but there's a lacuna there. There's plenty of capital out there, but the big banks that signed up for GFANs, they're looking for a pipeline, as David pointed out. If it doesn't have $50 million, they're not interested. It's not that the capital isn't there, it's just too small. And then there's the valley of death between the project idea and bankability and all the money that has to be spent on pre-feasibility, environmental assessment, site location, which you're going to ask one developer to build one project and take all that and hope they have the framework and get the right PPA. You get what you get now, which is very few companies that are that are interested in. So, I mean, I think, so we're talking about a couple of things that have to be filled in order to bridge this gap to bankability, from inspiration to bankability. And one, I think this falls on the MDBs and the US and the UAE and the UK and others, which is to help buy down some of this cost of the valley of death, those studies. That's the burden for the outsiders. For the country, it's this framework. You have to have, I think, comprehensive national frameworks that attract investment. They're going to have each of these pieces, or you're still going to get it project by project. And we talked in the beforehand about Argentina and their Renovar program. I mean, there are examples of countries that have put these kind of comprehensive frameworks together and attracted enormous amounts of investment in a short period of time because they anticipate all the guarantee, risk, transmission, competitive, open access problems, but they tell you up front, this is how this is going to work. So I think there's an answer there. But the big lacuna here is if you're going to do this from solving one project at a time, there have to be funds to bridge that valley of death, build that pipeline to access the capital. Otherwise, the risk is high. And we see this in the region. The countries have 100% renewable goals, and you have an outcry for the return of Petrocaribe, which is basically saying, until we get to 100% renewables, we need a discount on heavy fuel oil or a loan for heavy fuel oil because that's what we're actually using. If nobody's coming in to rescue us from that problem, then we got to fix the problem we've got, which is how do we finance heavy fuel oil? So it's, you know, there's a huge gap here, and that's what we're really not paying enough attention to.
David, thanks for that. Before we jump into international issues, I'd like to dive a little deeper into more domestic issues that you mentioned in your previous intervention. You mentioned the issue of utility reform, issues of scale, of modernization, of there not being a pipeline, but one at a time projects. What can you tell us about how countries are tackling these challenges? I know you have deep expertise in Guyana. If you could mention specific examples of the country, but you know they have a low carbon development strategy. What are they doing in real life to get to those low carbon development goals? Do they have the tools? Do they have the political will?
Well, I think, yeah, Guyana is particularly, I mean, as they grow electricity, they don't have the utility problem per se. I would say on paper, Guyana has a great strategy. They have this low carbon development strategy. They're looking at building out transmission. They're looking at investing in solar in the rural areas. They're looking at distributed generation. And so the overall top line strategy looks very impressive. But to actually deliver that strategy, you have to have, you know, you have to have an assessment of where is the transmission network going to go? How will you get the land? Where will it be? Have you done an environmental assessment for that? What kind of generation will you have? You have to map which different regions are going to need different kinds of electricity. That work, I mean, to be charitable, has not yet begun. So the gap between having the strategy and delivering the strategy is still quite large. And that's what needs to be done. The other thing which Guyana is talking about is great plans on electricity, and they have the gas project, you know, which is going to provide gas, you know, basically Exxon would say it's not excess gas, but it would provide gas from those fields to provide electricity, to provide base load, so you can have industry in Guyana. That's a good strategy. But there's controversy over how much it wants it, but you're going to have gas-fired generation as well. So, so I think those are good kind of top-line strategies, but the other thing Guyana needs to do is have the capacity in the government to be able to manage all of these procurements and all of this infrastructure and all this development. And right now, Guyana's civil service is basically political. And every time there's an election, the entire civil service, save for a couple of people, turns over, and you have no continuing capacity. So one of the things Guyana needs to do is invest in a civil service and independent regulation and professionalization to be able to manage this money. Otherwise, you get the problem which every resource-rich country has had except for Botswana and Norway, which is incredibly wasteful spending and high corruption risk and an inability to deliver. So, you know, Guyana is headed in the right direction, but the hard work of implementation and capacity, which you need to deliver that, that's still ahead of us.
David Rivera, would you like to add any insights about implementation in any specific country?
Yeah, again, I agree with David saying he just described the situation in terms of the political risk and the cycles almost in every country in the region. Um, every time there's a change in administration, that usually means a restart of the energy initiatives, which is a big challenge. And it takes 2 years again to get that going. And then guess what? The third or fourth year, there's campaigning elections again, and the cycle starts all over. So tremendous challenges to overcome. But in terms of, some of the regional successes and those that are very focused on the energy transition, the planning process is critical, and that was mentioned a couple times already. Have a really concrete, just not a energy transition plan, but integrated resource and resilient plan, because I could give you example after example where the resilience wasn't a factor, including my personal story in Anguilla, where after years of hard work, it wasn't resilient, and Hurricane Irma came along and blew away the entire plan. So that's another risk that the region faces. But there are successes. There are ways that in places that it's happening. In terms of a radical way, Barbados is that example. It presents a lot of challenges, but I think they'll overcome that. Jamaica is another good example where they've spent a lot of time developing the plan and the infrastructure and working with the utility, although contentiously in many cases, to get to a place where they can have big swaths of energy just transitioned. But one thing that is also happening, which is not a bad thing, because I moved back to the Caribbean would have been 15 years ago, and I had all hopes that Anguilla would have been 100% transition within 5 years. I actually went into the interview with a plan. Well, 12 years later, we were back to zero after the hurricane, right? But just getting to at that time, the roughly 7% was difficult. And all of the challenges that we spoke about existed. And you had to work to overcome it. The MDBs and everything associated with it, we had to work to overcome it. So it can be done. It just takes a lot of labor intensive, a lot of resource capacity. But in terms of the smooth transactional way of making this happen legislatively, policy, and so forth, both in the transportation space and in the energy space, I think Jamaica is probably a good example. It took them almost 10 years to get here, but that's a roadmap for others to follow in no more than 2 years do they need to go through that planning process. And the transition itself, the investment is probably the only challenge that would have to overcome to actually make it happen, because technically it can be done.
Vera, go ahead.
I just agree. And I'd like to add a couple of things. Well, first of all, in addition to the project risks that one looks at, you're right. Now, availability of insurance is a big one that didn't used to be, right? Because of climate change in the Caribbean. But I think it's important to think of the projects and in the energy sector as, having a number of risks. We know market risk, project risks, but and how to de-risk those. But we're talking about equity being more interested. How do we get that? At the end of the day, there is a risk that can be de-risked more, which is the legal and regulatory risk that we've been talking about, right? Which is partially these plans, but also just ensuring that there's a good regulatory capacity and a good regulatory framework. What does that mean? Some countries have done it better than others because they've had more time. And what we see in, for example, in Jamaica, there's a form of financeable PPA that was essentially used for the Dr. Bird project some 20 some years ago. And that has become sort of the model. So when investors, equity or debt will look at the PPA, it's going to be based on that model, and there's confidence in it. So those types of things it's not in all countries, but this is where there's is an advantage, I think, for Jamaica. The other aspect is the regulatory capacity of the professionalism. Jamaica has OUR. I think that there's a greater role for the World Bank and other institutions, not just in terms of financing, giving the money, but also helping to cover this gap on regulatory capacity, the human resources part of it. And the last thing I'll add there is, in the World Bank, I was on a panel in November when the new president spoke on the energy panel, and one of the panelists said that, yes, we understand that more countries need to have financeable PPAs, especially with the technology, battery storage, moving ahead so quickly and not being really built into the PPAs. How does that get priced? Who has control over the battery storage systems? And so World Bank is working on a form of PPA that contains the battery storage component, which could be utilized, again, to become a financeable document that is available in the region. And I think those are the kinds of things that governments can do to help enhance investment into the sector that can be done to enhance equity investment, and that don't, hopefully with some cooperation with MDBs, can be done with institution building resources.
Thanks, Vera. And David Gomes, you've talked a little bit about your frustration with the role of MDBs. Let's talk a little bit about it more. I hear, for example, a lot of financing geothermal, for example, in Dominica, of the IFC providing regulatory and training or aid for increasing regulatory capacity. What is in their hands feasibly to reduce political risk, to provide some sort of insurance? What else is in their hands? What are they bringing to the table, and what could they do better?
Wow, you just opened up a can of worms there. I mentioned spending nights as the CEO of Anguilla Electricity Company when we were building our solar farm. It probably took us 2 years to get through the hurdles of the MDBs, broadly packaging as MDBs. But it's a persistent problem throughout the region. Actually, utilities don't even want to work with MDBs because of the amount of resource and capacity that you have to put into getting through these hurdles. And they have a lot of significant problems and challenges to solve on a day-to-day basis. And that means more people, more investment, more cost, and so if I were to describe it this way, I know the MDBs in particular, all of them probably have the same challenge. They're going to say, we don't have the funding. Actually, I say that all the time. We don't have the funding to invest. There are a lot of commitments, but we don't actually have the funding. So it goes back to the partnership countries or the coalition of countries that fund the MDBs. So it comes back to the same place again in terms of the developed countries and their commitments to the MDBs. I'll put a pin in that for a second because I do believe that there's a big gap in terms of what the developed countries, I'm sitting here in Washington, D.C., and what Washington, D.C. is bringing to the table in particular, because there's a sort of equity or just transition challenge and equity challenge that we have to consider in light of, I just spoke about in so many ways, this challenge is so permeates the experience in the region. But I just mentioned we spent about 5 years in total getting our first solar farm on the ground, and then immediately it was wiped out by Hurricane Irma. That year we had 3 hurricanes, Irma, Maria, Gonzalo, I mean, a whole bunch of them just coming down our way. The next year or the year after, there was Dorian in the Bahamas. Immediately 2020, there were like 5 Category 5 hurricanes circulating in the region, and everybody's on pins and needles wondering who's going to get hit. It's like, Russian roulette, right? It is such a systemic problem that, and Mia Motley champions this message a lot, so I'm going to lean on her a little bit here, but essentially, they contribute way less than 1%. We use 1% because that's as low as you can go to make it meaningful. But at the end of the day, way less than 1% to the challenge of climate change, but yet the impact is tremendous, 7 times more than any other region. So, and that creates another challenge that we have to overcome. So I believe the MDB's problem is maybe sometimes they're slow, bureaucratic, and so forth. But the real problem is the money needs to be put up, the money needs to be released, and everybody needs to get away from the fact that, oh, it's too many challenges. We know how to solve this problem. We just need to commit the money and get it done.
Pick up on
Please
just
go
on
ahead.
David's point. I mean, it's understandable, but really unfortunate that, like these just transition, these JTEPs, that are focused on South Africa and Indonesia. In the climate change world, all of the attention is focused on the large emitters, which makes a lot of sense because you want to reduce emissions. But in terms of just transition, the island states are, as David pointed out, the victims of climate change. And the cost of the transition for them is significantly smaller than for a South Africa. So why isn't there an island state JTEP? You could start with the Caribbean as a pilot, and you could do the Pacific Islands as another one, because there is a lot of capital out there, or at least people are like to get patted on the back for the capital they commit at these COPs. But no one has actually made the Caribbean or the other island states enough of a focus of that. And that's where you're going to get the money. You're not going to get a new appropriation from the U.S. Congress to drop $5 billion into the Caribbean. I mean, they care about the Russians and the Venezuelans and everybody else, and the Chinese, but not enough to put that much money up. But there's a lot of money out there in climate, and I think it's a political challenge more than it is a capital challenge to say, if you want to do something about just transition, this is where you ought to be spending your money. And the dollars we're talking about for model PPAs, for credit guarantees, that's a manageable number given the scale that people commit in their press releases at each of the COPs.
And I'll just add, we can't forget that there are regional banks, right? FCIB, they're in the Caribbean. They are investing, not just corporate loans, a lot of project finance loans. They mobilize other capital. And as far as the focus on the region, I mean, IDB Invest, I know is a very strong focus currently on the Caribbean, precisely because of the small size, those challenges, right, which an MDB is appropriate to take up. I think one of the big advantages with an MDB is that you can open the way for other investors, impact investors to come in, and you can mobilize capital with an MDB that also brings, yes, it may take a long time, but their focus is ensuring that the project is bankable. So if the project is not bankable, there are other issues that one has to deal with, right? Figuring out how to make it bankable. But in order to get the funds, the project does need to be bankable, which brings me back to the point that de-risking, if the government parties will step in and improve some of these issues related to the legal and regulatory risk, that helps a lot.
Yes, and that was my follow-up question. So in turn, what can governments do to take advantage of this capital that is out there? So what is the role of regulators in setting the contractual underpinnings for different energy projects? And I'm especially thinking about PPAs. You've talked about how to integrate storage in PPAs. So we've talked about bankability a lot, but how about transparency? How to make sure that projects and agreements are transparent, that they're competitive? What are your suggestions, and what is, again, politically feasible? There.
We mentioned this before. There haven't been, sometimes auctions for PPAs are delayed. Takes a long time for different reasons. But when the auctions are done, it's very important to be able to demonstrate, as I said before, to investors that the process is clear. I'm going to take a page book out of the Guatemalan experience. So in Guatemala, which is, they have merchant plants and a very open, transparent auction system. What happens is they purchased the technology software program so that everybody puts in their bids. They're opened at the same time. It shows up on screens. There is a lot of confidence in the way the auction is conducted because you see the results in real time. Yes, that required an investment, but I don't think it was a huge investment. Another, to the extent that countries may not have the capacity, the regulatory capacity to produce tender terms that are going to be accepted in the market, but that have the correct balancing of risks between the utility and and the private sector, it's also possible to hire consultants that can help them. And that's an outlay of money, which possibly there could be funding for those. At the end of the day, what you want to be able to do is to make sure the auction can be conducted on terms that engender investor confidence in the auction and in the PPA.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, I was thinking of it in the context of back at the utility again and what it took to get projects through the pipeline. And you're right. There are a number of steps that need to happen. Investors, developers need to have the confidence that you've taken those steps. They don't want to come in and have to reinvent the wheel, start from square one. The return on investment is just not strong enough, or the percentage may be strong, but the dollar value may not be strong enough for them to care. So they're not going to come in, and that's goes back to the scale issue that David previously mentioned, and that is, if there was larger scale like Argentina or any of the Latin American countries that have made tremendous progress, everyone is lined up to get in because the one big deal is substantial enough. So it will take a number of things that we've discussed, both on the regulatory side, on the government in terms of transparency, because many of the utilities are government owned. If you cut a deal, or if the utility enters a deal today and elections are a month from now, will that transaction get canceled? So you need that level of certainty there. But I think just purely from a economic standpoint, if you get catalytic sort of impact investors more involved and they can understand the market better, the returns are guaranteed. No other region is doing 40 and 50, and in some cases 60 cents per kilowatt hour. That's 4 times higher than I'm paying here in Washington, D.C. So the returns are there. The fuel cost alone, the offset that could be put into a feed-in tariff, that alone can pay for battery and solar and wind. Wind, there's a little different experience country by country because I spoke about hurricanes and a few other things, but at the end of the day, it can be done. So if it's on the economic side, it's possible, it's feasible. I think every government campaigns on energy. We're having that conversation from the representative from a room. Every government campaigns on energy. So we know the interest is there. It's just harnessing all of that in that short window of time that they have to make the transition happen.
Before I open to questions from the audience, I have a final question for David Goldwyn, and that's a geopolitics question. It's actually a two-part question. First, David, how are countries in the region navigating US-China rivalry? And the second part of the question is more US specific. What sort of threat, I may say, do US near-term engagement, or is it threatened by elections in the country? And even more specifically, there are initiatives like PAC 2030. Do you see any progress? Have they make a dent? Do you see them threaten vis-a-vis the elections coming in November? So what's your perspective on that broader geopolitical landscape?
Well, let me take the second one first. I mean, I think the noble as they are, they're, the American Prosperity Initiative, the PAC 2030. I think they're concerned about more than just energy. Obviously, they have multiple sectors, but I think they are mostly aspirational at this point. I really think we're not moving at the scale that we need to be able to solve some of the problems we're talking about before. I think we're not talking about huge dollars, but we do not have a system design that's going to deal with some of these problems and move things. And our elections from the presidential elections are a risk because I don't think that the region is particularly a priority for the Trump campaign. It really wasn't. The frame was largely Venezuela. Are you with us or against us? And I think we're likely to see that kind of maximalist policy return. So that's really the orientation for the Caribbean. So putting more money in, kind of dealing with these issues, I think probably not likely. On US-Chinese competition in the region, I mean, clearly the Chinese are competing for influence. Some of this is Taiwan driven. Some of this is infrastructure driven. And I think most of the countries are taking as balanced approach as they can to take the help where they can get it. and to maintain good relations with the U.S. I think the challenges with Chinese investment, as we've seen with sort of roads in Jamaica and other places, that countries end up being highly indebted. Often the local population can't use things like the toll road, and so sort of the neo-colonialist approach of the Chinese is having some negative reactions. I mean, Guyana is kind of an interesting example where the Chinese are invested. They're CNOOC is in the Stabroek, and so they have an interest there. They're doing things U.S. companies don't want to do: railroad, engineering, water, sometimes electricity. There's just U.S. companies are not interested in doing these kinds of projects in South America, much less in the Caribbean. And so, countries are interested in dealing with the partners who will solve their problems. So in Guyana, they're getting a little bit of military assistance from the Chinese, just some trucks and things like that. But when it comes to Venezuela and Essequibo, Chinese are like, well, we're hoping for a peaceful solution. It's like, so are we from the Guyanese perspective. So that's that American financial interest, the security interest, the geopolitical interest. I mean, we're not really too worried about Chinese competition in Guyana. But in the region, I mean, I think it points up the larger problem, which is if we do care about Chinese influence in the region, if we care about not having countries return to relying on Venezuela for support, then you can't beat something with nothing. So, we've got to come up with something that would help solve the country's problems. And, it may be that there's a financing issue that these governments need to deal with to get through the energy crisis, which you could leverage for national change to create a more competitive environment for the energy transition. But, we've talked about all of these problems. None of these are things which are new to the U.S. in terms of how to help them. The U.S. has been doing basically energy adjustment stuff for 30 years. The question is, do we have focus on it? Just to give you one last point, when we cared about the Caspian Basin, so it's like we wanted to have the Caspian to be energy independent, to have their own infrastructure so they would be free of the Russians and they could support Europe. This was 35 years ago. I'm old enough to have been part of that initiative when it started. We had an ambassador for Caribbean Basin energy diplomacy for over 2 administrations, or probably 4 administrations, Republican and Democratic, for 25 years. Dick Morningstar, I think, did it twice. And that's what the U.S. government does when it's focused on a region. Like, we weren't going to be importing Caspian oil. We weren't going to be importing Caspian gas. Wasn't really that big a deal in the global market, although people had a lot of hype about it. It was a geopolitical project, and frankly, it succeeded fantastically. That's what we do when we want to solve a problem. We're not doing that in the Caribbean right now. We're not doing it in South America, and that's what I'd like to see.
Thanks for that, David. Now we'll take a round of questions from the audience. Please go ahead. We also have burning questions in the Zoom Q&A about Essequibo and about potential oil sharing revenues. But let's go with the audience here first. Please go ahead.
Thank you for your comments. I'm Steve Powell, Managing Director of Sino Powell Capital. You all know what capital is. I'm Powell. Sino is a prefix that means China. We've developed and financed 7 renewable projects in Mexico, a country that has certain problems. But we were able to assemble those projects and put them together to reach a scale that made it very interesting for other investors and vendors to be interested in. My question is, in the Caribbean, where you have a lot of small countries, each with very risky governments, has there been any effort for either a developer or a fund to combine the countries and aggregate some projects throughout different countries to make it more attractive for investors? Thank you.
Thank you. Why don't we take a first round of questions and then we go ahead with the answer. The gentleman in the front.
I appreciate the comments. Ken Phelan with Storm Center Communications. We're a geospatial mapping technology company. We're NASA technology, so we do energy modeling and analysis. My question is kind of like twofold. Is COP28 friendly to the Caribbean? And what role is the Caribbean playing in trying to, I guess, develop a futuristic and creative COP28 that relies on renewable energy, energy efficiency, and resilience and sustainability?
Okay, shall we? Let's start with David.
Yeah, sure. I agree with your, even in Mexico, and I'm sure those projects are those gigawatt level projects. And you had to aggregate them at that scale. There isn't much in that scale for the Caribbean region. We're only I want to say overall above a gigawatt, maybe a 1.5, somewhere there. So, but it actually doesn't require that level of scale to make it attractive from a percentage standpoint, right? So I keep stressing the percentage. The returns are there, guaranteed. It's not there at the scale in terms of the dollar volume of, am I going to make $1 million or am I going to make $1 billion or $10 million? That's the challenge we have to overcome. But there are some efforts to do some aggregation. There's the CARICOM Resilience Fund, which I mentioned, which was launched and successfully was a partnership with USAID and a couple of other entities that supported that all through the process over the last couple of years. Then the launch involved a Caribbean-based investment fund that is managing the fund itself, and then RMI from a technical support, technical assistance to create those bankable pipeline of projects. So the projects are coming through. The fund is being capitalized, and there's an investment fund manager, and it had its seed funding of about 15 million. Now, I say that, now say, okay, there are some other initiatives, 5 million here, 10 million there, over the last 5 years. So it's not even every year that you're getting 5 million or 10 million. It goes over a long period of time. So in aggregate, it's a small amount of funding that is coming to the region to solve all the problems we described. So there are a lot of things happening. There are a lot of announcements, and there are a lot of great things to be done, but there just needs to be much more aggressive, much more sort of urgency put around solving the problem for the many reasons we described. Sorry, in terms of technology, there is a significant effort, and there are a lot of solutions that are sort of being brought to. I'd love to learn more about your solution in the geospatial mapping and so forth and analysis. There are a lot of tools that are available there. Sometimes they're just very expensive, and each country has a challenge. So we can do the aggregation and some of the other things to solve that problem too.
Okay.
I'll just add on, piggybacking on what you said, I agree that unlike Mexico, where the projects are larger and it is easier to aggregate because you are also in Mexico and you're doing a financing based on one single country's particular risks for the investor. As you pointed out, in the Caribbean countries, these are smaller size economies, and each country with their distinct regulatory risks. So when the banker or the investor puts their hat on, they're going to look at, part of their diligence, even if they're going to do a portfolio financing, right, is to look at each country's specific regulatory risks for that, for that transaction or the series of transactions. Now, debt, commercial banks, NDBs are always talking about finding, I think there's, if it can be done, a portfolio financing for a country that has maybe a series of projects that can be replicated very similar. DG or other projects where you can have similar project documents, PPAs, and where you can finance them based on, a series that are done over time. We haven't seen a lot of that precisely because of these issues that we're talking about, where you need the scale, but you also, when you're aggregating, there's a lot of time for the bankers spent on reviewing each of the country's risks. I will mention that in the Dominican Republic, we know of at least one fund there that is, again, focused on the Dominican Republic, but it has tapped in, in pension, local money, pension funds and others. And as you said before, they understand the risks and they're very successful. But again, that's one country's regulatory framework, not, the type of regional fund as you're mentioning.
Just to give you 15 seconds also, the Eastern Caribbean, I think, has potential, but you've got to solve the trust issue. Is one country can rely on another for delivery electricity? That's a big hurdle. And then the intergovernmental agreement on transmission, which is who's going to pay for that transmission line to go from one place to the other. And generally, it's the person on the buy side who also has to trust the country sending it to deliver the electricity. That's why it hasn't been done yet.
Would anybody like to tackle the question about Guyana and Venezuela and what's going on? What's going to happen with energy security, with perhaps an oil sharing, revenue sharing agreement? Is that in the foreseeable future? How do you think the conflict is going to evolve?
Between sharing between, well, those are two different issues. There's the threat to Guyana, but who's talking about energy sharing between Venezuela and Guyana? Is that
Well,
what you're saying?
the foreign minister of Venezuela said that he would be able to stop the conflict if there was some sort of agreement of revenue sharing between, and I think that's what they're going to bring to the talks.
Ah, I see. Okay. And then if pigs had wings, they'd fly. Okay. So, yeah, I think this, obviously it's a very sensitive issue. And I was in Guyana in October. Ambassador Sonali is here. He knows this far better than I do. I mean, every ministry has a Kibo Azar's bumper sticker in there. Tremendous fear in Guyana. But first, the legal issue I think is pretty clear and in favor of Guyana. And I think Guyana has encouraged a pause in some of the sensitive areas until the court makes its ruling, which I thought was a very smart diplomatic move on their part. But this is not going to be a revenue sharing or a negotiation between the two countries. And Venezuela is just wrong on this issue. And I think the U.S. has made its point clear, which is that it believes that the rule of law ought to be followed, and that favors Guyana. I don't think at this point, I mean, our colleagues from Exxon are here. They are, development proceeds apace. I think this is largely election politicking, since both the Venezuelan, both Maduro regime and the opposition both take this provocative posture because it's popular there. But I think it's unlikely to go beyond that. And I think the Brazilians have made their view clear that they would not be happy about a move here. And there's probably very few things that would draw U.S. military intervention into the Western Hemisphere, given the history of U.S. military intervention. But I think, a move by Venezuela like this would probably make the list, or at least high consideration. And it makes no sense for a Venezuela which is trying to reconnect with the international community. Nothing would unite international, sort of sentiment and sanctions against Venezuela than crossing a sovereign border. So, yeah. No revenue sharing.
And we will end on that sobering note. On behalf of the Inter-American Dialogue, the Energy Program, and the Energy and Resources Committee, I want to thank all our panelists for a thought-provoking discussion. We appreciate your expertise, and the invitation is always open for you to return to the dialogue. Thank you to all the attendees for making it all the way to our office on a cold day, and to my colleague Michael Kearns for helping to organize this discussion. We look forward to seeing you in our next event. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.